how can a democracy possibly function if there isn't anything which brings its people together?
I'm Emma Trimble, and this is GBN Originals. Now, before we get stuck into it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now, today I'm joined by Harry Saul Markham, who has written an interesting new book called The Melted Pot: Anti-Semitism, Diversity and the Limits of Tolerance. Thank you so much for joining us today, Harry. So let's begin by telling us a little bit about why you chose to write this book. What was it that inspired you?
Well, one of genuine concern about the future of Western Europe, about the delusions which I think have gripped our liberal elite, and the need for an urgent reckoning with the very future of liberalism and where it has gone so desperately wrong. And I was the first sort of big moment for me was back in the May of 2021 after a really horrifying ordeal on the streets of London. And I realized that something really has gone awry and we need to talk about it, and we need to really investigate the cultural, social, philosophical and political roots of what I consider to be the crisis of our time.
So you are yourself from a minority community. Do you think that multiculturalism has failed when we see things like one example would be the way that the campaign for anti-Semitism was told to move on at various points by the police rather than the police protecting them from the potential pro-Palestine mob? Do you think that multiculturalism has failed because there are certain communities that don't respect other minorities, or do you think that actually this is a particular problem, but that multiculturalism in general is still something that perhaps you think is worthwhile?
Well, I shrink from the word failure because I don't consider multiculturalism to be a failure. I think of it in its essence to be a delusion. I think the ideas which underpin it, most notably cultural relativism, and the idea that all cultures are of equal value and that you can integrate cultures in a cohesive and in a way which would ensure the stability of a democracy. I consider that very notion to be delusional. So I don't think of it as a failure, but I do think that example you highlighted, I think it points to a state in which we have become so magnanimous to the extent that our own magnanimity hasn't really any limits. It has no clear boundaries. And so the kind of things that you see on the streets, be that Jewish groups being targeted, or what we experienced in the May of 2021, or anything really since October 7th, I think that points to a culture in which our openness has allowed for the very forces which we thought our openness would destroy, the forces of extremism, fanaticism, and totalitarianism. And that, to me, is what those in positions of power don't seem to realize, is that the very things they thought would get rid of all societal ills has actually become its ally, its enabler.
So some people would say, you know, we're dominated by this culture of not being judgmental. And so actually the problem is that the state has basically just withdrawn itself from, you know, judging whether one culture is better than another and so on. But somebody might come back to that and say, well, actually it looks as if through that withdrawal, a two-tier system has been created where actually those who are the bullies, those who shout the loudest, are the ones who get preferential treatment, and actually they just stomp all over the weaker communities that they're targeting. Is that something that, you know, informs your concern about the limits of tolerance? Do you think the state should be drawing clearer lines about what is and isn't acceptable?
Well, the state, in a sense, is impotent. Excuse me. The state, in effect, can't do much because, of course, the state itself is a product of a culture which really doesn't understand itself, right? So this is why this issue will never be resolved on a mere policy level. So yes, it's all well and good to talk about two-tier justice and stuff, but I want to look at really the cultural and philosophical foundations of what has spawned this or given birth to this two-tier justice system, and I think that the state itself and the lack of readiness the state exhibits in tackling these forces, I think, is very much a consequence of a cultural negligence over the past, I don't know, I think probably since 1945, but of course, you know, I think over at least the past 50 years, to have an understanding of what it means to be a part of a civilization. And what does it mean to be a Westerner? What does it mean to be open? And what are the limits of that openness, right? And these questions can't be answered in the arena of politics or the arena of government. They have to be addressed on that cultural and philosophical level, and they haven't been. And the state is very much just the product of that cultural vacuum.
Cultural negligence, I think, is a fantastic term. You should absolutely coin that. Do you?
I will do.
Let's just try and break this down a bit. So what are the things that you feel are the problem here? What are the symptoms of, you're saying that the government, that society at large has been culturally negligent, that things have broken down, and there are obviously negative symptoms of that. What are those symptoms as far as you're concerned?
Well, I mean, they're manifold. I mean, so of course, my particular example, what the question which my book grapples with is how one minority might feel so threatened by another minority, right? In the name of multiculturalism. And that's a question which I think few have readily investigated. And it's a question which demands urgent attention. And of course, that question has implications which extend well beyond minorities. It's about democracy. And I see that the atomization of society, the emergence of what the late Chief Rabbi Sachs described as hotels in the place of a shared home, which is a very useful way of thinking about multiculturalism, I think. The emergence of that has very real consequences for democracy. Because, of course, democracy itself rests upon cohesion amongst the demos, amongst the people. This was a point, of course, observed by John Stuart Mill in his principle of cohesion, that there can, the point of having shared culture, identity, and values isn't just a nice thing, isn't just a thing which promotes a degree of communitarianism and a sense of responsibility to one another. It's much more than that. It's about laying the very foundations for a functioning democracy. And so what I see, and what prompted me, one of the major reasons which prompted me to write the book, is that I see our very democracy in a state in which its very future is questionable now. Because how can a democracy possibly function if there isn't anything which brings its people together?
But of course, part of the problem, I think, is this isn't the case for people in our society at large. I think most average Brits have a pretty firm sense of right and wrong and are capable of making judgments in their everyday life on small issues, on big issues. But the problem has been this sort of crisis of legitimacy, of authority, of the ability to make judgments. And what you're advocating for depends on the government being able to assert itself in some way. And in order to assert itself, it would need to justify that assertion. So how do you see it, as being possible for the government to move from this position of effective cultural relativism to a position of actually being able to say, no, this is the culture that is justified. These are the boundaries. These are the limits. How does a government do that when it's lost all sense of authority?
Well, it can't. And that's why I'm so worried about the situation. It can't, because if it has no understanding of what are the limits, if it has no understanding of its, and the reason it has no understanding of its limits. I mean, the moral maxim of our age is love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, what is thyself, right? And, you know, it's very hard to love and extend tolerance to something when you have no real understanding of who you really are, which is why, and I see that the major source of this crisis, this cultural crisis, is coming from the world of the intelligentsia, because of course it's in the world of thinking which has motivated us all to think beyond the nation state, think beyond cultural unity and conformity and all the things which bind us together. It's that kind of mindset which of course has percolated its way down into government. And and so long as the world of ideas and the intelligentsia remain very much committed to this post nation state, post cultural cohesion view, then governments simply are unable to act. Now, my view is that I would love governments to be able, particularly liberal governments, just to be a bit tougher and just to be able to say, and to be able to basically say the kind of things Rupert Lowe is saying. Because I don't think I think what Rupert Lowe and the likes of him advocate are perfectly compatible with centrist positions. That is to assert that there are some things which are unacceptable, and to say that if you want to be a part of our country, you have to do certain things. That to me is perfectly sensible and appropriate. But liberal governments, because they are very much the fruits of what's been brewing in liberal institutions, particularly universities, they're unable to. And I don't see a way of them being able to wake up from their intellectual and cultural slumber unless populism is able to achieve some electoral success.
I think So I think I'm right in thinking that you have said previously that you want a kind of populist centrism, and you cite people like John Stuart Mill. So you're pitching your argument sort of on a liberal foundation. One of the core tenets of liberalism, of course, is that the government has a very limited authority, a very limited remit, and people's personal lives, whether religious or otherwise, are somewhat outside of that jurisdiction. And John Stuart Mill's argument was that unless somebody is harming somebody else, harming their rights, depriving them of their rights, then they should just be allowed to get on with it. What would you say in response to, for example, the recent debate about banning the burqa, for example, things that, you know, maybe are damaging to social cohesion, but that liberalism finds it very difficult to justify placing a limit on it or to justify judging it in any way?
Well, the issue that you've mentioned, specifically the burqa, amongst other things, is that it does raise the issue of this harm principle that Mill described. And of course, I have to think, well, do women choose to wear the burqa? And if so, that right must be protected. But if we know of cases where women are compelled to wear it, then there is a duty in this kind of million line of train of thought for the state to act and say, this isn't happening. And so, look, liberals have a very tricky task of establishing what is and what is not acceptable. But the bottom line is this: if people are being coerced to wear something or forced to act in a way in which they lose their autonomy and so on, then it's incumbent on the state to say this is not acceptable. And I fear that in too many cases, with burqa wearing and so on, that women are deprived of that choice and that autonomy. And therefore, I think it probably is incumbent upon the state to deal with it.
But when it comes to where a liberal state draws the limits of tolerance, whether a person has consented or not, if your concern is social cohesion, people might choose not to speak English. They might choose never to learn English. They might choose to close themselves off from British society, to not participate and to not integrate. So how can a liberal state deal with those people who do not consent to integrating, who actively choose to separate themselves from society for religious reasons or otherwise? How is it possible for the liberal state to actually coerce or compel integration? And if they're not able to do that, then how is integration and social cohesion possible if it's regarded by liberals as too coercive?
Right. Excuse me, I'm just recovering from COVID. I don't want to give my last chapter away in which I formulate
Spoiler
and
alert.
propose some suggestions. Well, I wouldn't. I want people. I want to do that because I need people to buy the book. But I think there are several things. The first is that when people choose not to integrate, that to me is a violation of the harm principle. It is harmful. And it's detrimental to the very cohesion and well-being of society. So I do think that there is a harm principle case to be made here. However, if people are citizens of this country and they have a British passport, there's very little the state can do. It's this form of social engineering is not possible now. So people who choose to live segregated lives in Tower Hamlets or Bradford or whatever, they're by and large British citizens, and ostensibly they're as British as you and me, right? For people who are not citizens, that's I think less problematic because we have a choice. Do we want these people to be citizens or not? But for the case of people who live here and are part of our culture and society, even if they don't deem themselves to be a part of it or part of those things, I don't think the state can do much. However, I do think there are proactive things we can do for people who are for people who do wish to integrate. And I think that the kind of things we should be doing and the state should take a much more active role in the promotion of the learning of English, doing what some Scandinavian states are doing now in terms of promoting lessons on our values and stuff. And Ayan Hirsi Ali has written a great deal on this in her book Pray, and I commend it to you. So the state can do things, but of course the state is limited if we're dealing with people who have been living here for a very long time and are citizens, and that begs the question: is it all too late?
But the problem
is, in some cases, it might be.
The problem is, I think that if it requires on gentle encouragement, there will always be those people who are so entrenched in their position they simply do not want to integrate. In fact, the reason why liberal democratic societies appeal to them is because they know that they can take the mick in that respect, that nobody's going to interfere with them. So somebody who maybe is a post-liberal, critic of liberalism, might say, well, it sounds to me as if liberalism isn't coherent, because on the one hand, liberalism requires coherence in order to secure everybody's rights and liberties, to stop one minority from trespassing on another minority's rights. But on the other hand, liberalism isn't capable of securing that coherence because it isn't able to actually do anything meaningful except gentle encouragement, and relies on the consent of people who just refuse to play ball.
Well, that probably is the shortcoming of liberalism, and yet my kind of strain of liberal populism is that liberals do become far more assertive than they already are, but there are limits to that degree of what David Cameron coined as muscular liberalism. It's not possible to remove people from a country who are citizens. Now, the state, the burqa is a symbol of division and a symbol of this kind of frightening atomization of British and Western society. I agree, but it's not. I think the crisis runs much deeper. And I think if you're to truly achieve a degree of cohesion, and mind you, I will say that my view of, I think we need to be clear on what I mean by cohesion. Cohesion isn't that people suspend their religious traditions or cultural loyalties and just embrace British values entirely and at the expense of their own identities. I mean, that to me is not cohesion. Cohesion to me is a hyphen. It's when people are able to say, look, I'm a British Jew and I very much embrace the values of this country. I accept them, I take them on, and I also maintain my own cultural tradition. And that's the kind of thing I want to see happen across communities in Britain, right? That it's not that they have to give up anything in order to integrate. But the state can do more than gentle encouragement. It can do things for people who are arriving here, which it hasn't done in terms of bringing people in, talking to them about the values we share and ensuring that they're integrating. If not, we don't have them as citizens. That's a perfectly reasonable proposition. But for the state to become illiberal and do things in which would like the kind of things where we would talk about mass deportations and stuff, well, that has very serious consequences and implications. And I think that I think the liberal state needs to act within the remit of what is acceptable within within the liberal orbit, but not be afraid to be assertive and tenacious in promoting that much needed cohesion.
When you talk about having a kind of hyphenated identity, if you believe that not all cultures are equal, and that's not to say that not all people are equal, those are two separate things. But if you don't believe that all cultures are equal, you don't necessarily believe very optimistically that all reasonable cultures will sort of be amenable to one another and be able to mix in a kind of melting pot rather than a melted pot. Do you think that there are some cultures that can't really cleave to British culture in the same way as, for example, Judaism can? I'm thinking, for example, of those people who would physically attack someone and try to murder them for burning a Quran. Those people are going to be very intransigent in their position and probably, I would imagine, unlikely to want to hyphenate their identity in that way.
Well, completely. And I mean, palpably, yes, that's the problem. I mean, my book deals with Islamism beyond Islamists. It looks at how extremist ideas have become mainstream in sections of our Muslim communities, and looks at how ordinary people in those communities are expressing ideas which are just so antithetical to our own. Doesn't mean they're Islamists. They're just ordinary people with ideas which are in opposition and undermine our own culture and values. That's where we are now, and that's why this problem is serious. The reason I advocate for a hyphenated identity is because those people are opposed to a hyphenated identity, right? They see that their religious attachment must triumph and prevail over anything else, and they reject the likes of the Sheikh who endorsed my book and other Muslims who I work with who want to see this reconciliation. And I don't want to be the ally of those who say, look, who say that you're either Muslim or British, right? As those people might be inclined to say. I want to be on the side of those liberal Muslim voices who are working for that change, which is why I call for that hyphenated identity. But you're right. The fact is, in these sections, and I'm afraid I think it probably goes beyond sections, there is a mainstream alienation from society at large. And that makes it very hard to achieve that hyphenated identity. And that's why I think there is a degree of urgency that we need to act now before it just becomes impossible.
You've acknowledged that there is an inherent vulnerability in liberal democracy.
Yes.
And whilst it, of course, is to the general benefit of social cohesion, that those who do feel able to hyphenate their identity do, and there's a lot of good work that can be done there in building that cohesion and bringing people together. And I don't think really there's anybody advocating for a perfectly monocultural society. I think everyone's happy with a bit of pluralism, but that's very different to cultural relativism, where we're not able to make any judgments about any other cultures. And I think whilst all of that is well and good, a critic might just say, well, the problem actually is coming from that intransigent group that refuse to hyphenate. So you can do all the good in the world, bringing people together who are reasonable and do want to participate in society together and respect each other and respect each other's differences. But there's this group of people, an increasingly large group of people, it seems, who fundamentally want to undermine the freedom and tolerance of everybody else in society. And not only everybody else in society, but primarily those within their own communities who don't have access to their rights in the way that others within a liberal democracy do. So I think critics would say to you, well, at what point would you start to wonder whether actually the problem might be liberalism, and whether some alternative post-liberal solution might be necessary in order to be robust enough to actually deal with this problem?
No, the problem is very much liberalism as it currently is, because it's become just useless. And that's why I do believe in the fundamental principles within liberal democracy. I believe in a secular state. I believe in a state in which people are free to be as, express themselves, attach themselves to whomever they like, within, of course, those boundaries. But I want to see, but I think liberals have failed to establish those boundaries, and that owes itself to the fact that liberals in intellectual circles have moved away from thinking in terms of our own culture, identity, and its values. But you are right in the sense that there is this intransigence, and that makes it very hard for any degree of reconciliation to be achieved, which is why I am feeling somewhat gloomy about the future. But I do think there are, when I look at the allure and the seductive nature of the kind of fanaticism which I describe in the book, I think it very much flourishes in a society which is so lost in terms of itself, which is lost in terms of its own values. There isn't a cohesive or any kind of meaningful national cultural identity and subsequent ideas on values and culture and so on. I think it's all very lost and wishy-washy. And so the prospect of religious attachments prevailing over any sense of cultural, social attachments, I think that the idea of the former becomes far more powerful and compelling because it does offer something substantive. It is concrete. And I just think now that I want to be able to see a kind of liberal nationalism, for liberals to re-engage with the conversation about everything which can offer people that path for meaning and responsibility, because of course it's meaning and responsibility which I think drive people towards forces which offer them that. And the liberal move away from those things, I think, is well, I mean, it's almost self-negating, because it's destroying the very liberalism they think will be saved without it.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to compete with those people who were so sure of themselves. And I couldn't really agree more. I think liberalism needs to, liberals need to remember that liberalism is a particular thing that we have inherited that needs tending to and protecting. So thank you so much, Harry Saul Markham, the author of Melted Pot, Anti-Semitism, Diversity and the Limits of Tolerance. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know what you think in the comments. It's so important that we have these conversations and look them in the eye. So I would love to know what you think. Let us know.